At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe in general, and Britain in particular, bestrode the world like a colossus. Now, a quarter of our way through the 21st century, we find ourselves at best diminished powers and at worst cringing vassals of the United States. How did the continent of Athens, Rome, Madrid, Paris, Berlin, and London become so enfeebled? And as we emerge from the warm bath of post-war comforts into the cold realities of a contentious, multipolar world, how are we to assert ourselves? Do we have it in us to stand on our own 2 feet again? With me to discuss whether the old world has life in her yet is Firas Modad, the geopolitical analyst and a presenter at the Lotus Eaters, where today we are filming a joint episode of my show, The Forge, and Firas's Realpolitik. Firas, thank you for sitting down with me.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Now, let's start with a sort of potentially slaughtering some sacred cows. I'm keen for your insight on this. Is the so-called special relationship between Britain and America, and even Europe and America, an expensive illusion, conjured to make us feel relevant in the world, but increasingly costing us dear?
It is certainly an illusion, because if you look at the geopolitical interests of the countries involved, be it Britain and the United States, or Britain and the rest of Europe, or the United States and the rest of Europe, they're not the same interests. They are absolutely divergent interests. And within Europe, the interests diverge. So there is the problem of the EU, which assumes that the critical interests of Poland are the same as the critical interests of Spain, which is fundamentally delusional. There is the special relationship of the United States with Israel, which is the only real special relationship that the United States seems to have. But to be fair, there are more shared interests between Britain and the United States than with the rest, shall we say.
Right.
Mainly because of the shared Atlantic basin. At the end of the day, the United States and Britain need the Atlantic to be secured and to be controlled in a particular way. They have similarities in their political systems, deep similarities in their culture. That creates a level of alignment. But today, the United States is not really looking at that. And Britain has sort of subordinated her own interests completely to those of the United States.
In A.J.P. Taylor's book, which I've got here, and which I'm going to quote from, he's very it's called The Struggle for Mastery in Europe. He is incredibly evocative about Europe's slide into relative insignificance at the end of the First World War. And I'm just going to read a choice passage to you, Firas, and get your thoughts on the matter. He talks about how the 70 years between 1848 and 1918 were the last age of the European balance of power, a balance reinforced by political and economic developments which had been expected to destroy it. The first 23 years, beginning in 1848, were a period of turmoil when the old order seemed to be crumbling. It ended with the Lesser Revision. The new national states of Germany and Italy were fitted into the system of the balance of power, and Europe combined vast range with international peace for more than a generation. Then the balance grew top-heavy and was challenged anew. But the First World War had none of the traditional outcomes. The balance was not restored. A single great power did not dominate the continent. There was not even universal revolution. The intervention of the United States overthrew all rational calculations. Henceforward, what had been the center of the world became merely the European question.
Yes.
That's A.J.P. Taylor in The Struggle for Mastery in Europe. And I suppose I would like to ask you, Firas, in your view, has the United States, whatever its exceptional virtues as a nation, had a malign influence on the happiness of Europe? And when would you date it from?
Certainly from the end of the First World War, because what happened was essentially that liberal democracy was imposed on the rest of Europe. Europe was having a huge debate. What kind of political system should it have? What was the correct balance between monarchy and aristocracy and popular will? That conversation pretty much ended with the defeat in World War I. The Germans and the fascists tried to renew the conversation in their own way. That ended disastrously. And since then, Europe has been a complete vassal. And you saw reports of the CIA intervening in French elections and in Italian elections to keep the communists out. You saw a level of intervention by the United States in pretty much every European question. The European Union was supposed to be a way to facilitate American influence over Europe. And then the end of the Cold War meant that more of Europe was incorporated under the American empire through NATO, which is what ended up leading to the Ukraine war. There was no sense anymore among policymakers that there has to be a buffer of sorts
Right.
between NATO and the Russian sphere of influence. And so the US's influence has been imperial and expansionist. The alternatives to it were terrible, be it Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union.
Of course, yes.
That should be factored into account. We shouldn't just bash the Americans.
No.
But after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, the Americans didn't just back away, and no empire would. Instead, they simply consolidated and expanded. And this would have been somewhat acceptable if a sense of nationalism had been retained,
Right.
and a sense of the importance of national production and national power had been retained,
And just self-respect.
and self-respect. But what ended up happening was the explosion of neoliberalism
Right.
and the moving of productive capacity away from the West and into Asia.
Yes.
And that was the completion of that disaster in a way.
I think you're right to recall us to the counterfactuals, like what are the alternatives to American dominance of the continent? I know, like if there is such a thing as a European question, as H.A.P. Taylor puts it, like who would you rather was answering that question, the Americans or the Soviets? Like we'd rather or the Nazis. We would prefer the Americans to be contending with that question in strict geopolitical terms. So maybe to some extent, given how history worked out in the first half of the 20th century, some period of European vassalage to the US or whoever else was inevitable. You just get to pick you get to pick your senior partner. But I suppose what I'm curious to understand is it's one thing to be realistic about that, as you have just been, but a strange feature of post-war moral discourse in Europe and in Britain, certainly, more so in Britain, I would argue, than in Europe, is this peculiar sentimentality about this vassalage. It's not treated as a kind of brute fact. It's treated as a sort of wonderful deliverance. And I've just got a couple of examples here. It's so easily disprovable. We've had both Harold Macmillan and Churchill were of course very sentimental about how after the Second World War, it's not that we were losing to America, it's more that the British spirit was entering this vigorous young body of the American post-war American hegemon. But we have FDR giving very favorable Lend-Lease terms to the Soviets and not giving those to Britain, which worsened our debt. You've got Eisenhower tanking the British pound during the Suez crisis. You've got even Reagan blindsiding Thatcher over Grenada. There are so many examples of the Americans not holding up their side of this so-called special relationship, and yet we seem to hold to it like a crutch. It's not just a recognition of brute geopolitical realities, it's something about which our politicians go gooey and weak-kneed.
It's a very effeminate, emotional way of dealing with reality. It's a sort of abused spouse syndrome, abused wife syndrome. Oh no, he's only doing it because he loves me, and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Whereas the reality of it is that the United States set out to absolutely destroy the independence of Europe and the power of Europe with malice, with conviction. And the Suez was a great example of that, because...
Tell people what that involved and entailed if they're not aware.
The Suez crisis, basically, there was a bit of nastiness, obviously, on the part of the British and the French and the Israelis.
Of course.
The three countries partnered together to take over the Suez Canal and make sure that it wasn't in the hands of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was working with the Soviets and was sort of closer to the Soviets at the time. The three cooked up a scheme to take over the Suez Canal, and they did. And the British took over the Suez Canal. And at that moment, the Americans, instead of siding with the Europeans, sided with the Egyptians and with the Soviet Union. And there were two communiques issued, one from Moscow, one from Washington, saying to France and Britain and Israel, you had better back down and give the Egyptians the Suez back, which was a huge humiliation. And it meant that the Americans were saying to Britain and France that even jointly, you could not pursue your geopolitical interests independently.
Yes.
And the importance of it is obviously the Suez. It's the main artery connecting the East and the West, and therefore it's critical to French trade and to British trade. That's why the French and the British fought so much over the Suez.
Yep.
But when they were of the same mind to retake it together and keep it away from Abdel Nasser and his Russian allies, the Americans actually turned against them. So that was an enormous slap in the face.
And also, I would say, just very quickly, extremely significant, given that we're talking here about, for people who don't know, about 1956.
Yes.
This is after George Kennan's famous memorandum about the need to contain the Soviet Union.
Yes.
So the containment doctrine was already
In effect.
And the Soviets had pulled off their first successful nuclear test, I believe, in 1949.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
it's incredible that the Americans sided with the Soviets against the British, the French, and the Israelis that early on in the Cold War.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that puts to rest the idea that the Americans, when exercising power, leave any space for sentimentality about their relationship with Britain.
Right.
But for British politicians, instead of facing that reality and saying that the answer has to be autonomous British power able to pursue its own interests regardless of what the Americans want, and a restoration of balance of power politics that would say, Britain is looking to threats to her sovereignty, and that does include a united Europe, Russia dominating Europe, and America dominating Europe. The response was a lot more emotional. No, they really do love us, and they really do care about us. And when you hear from people in DC decision-making circles about how do the British behave as allies, the answer is they're the best allies in the world because all they ask the Americans is, what can we do to help?
Yeah, and arguably the only post-war figure with any character, leading figure with any character in Europe on this point has been Charles de Gaulle, who was a little bit more, much more guarded of France's interests than I think any post-war British Prime Minister has been of Britain's.
So the French took a completely different approach. The French did learn their lesson from Suez.
Right.
And the reason the French have energy independence does come from that. The reason the French fight so fiercely when it comes to farm subsidies for the French is because they understood that the only way they can be an independent operator is to have energy autonomy, food security, and a fully autonomous military industrial chain, a vertically integrated military supply chain. And so France produces her own jets, France produces her own power, France has full food autonomy. They operate in a way that makes sure that they aren't dependent on anyone. And French strategic thinking has been far more realistic on that point than British strategic thinking.
Yes.
And it serves them well in every energy crisis. And it means that they still have some power projection capabilities. Their technology isn't that great. We saw French jets being defeated by Chinese jets in the Pakistan-India kerfuffle last year. The French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle leaves a lot to be desired, but it does sail, unlike some of the British ones.
Right. How do you account for Britain's failure to be realistic and it's succumbing to sort of a kind of post-war sentimentality on the significance and depth of the special relationship?
I think part of it has to do with the role of London as a financial center deeply intertwined with New York, which meant that there were special interests that didn't want some kind of political break because it would mean that these financial interests would be damaged. I think that's one part of it. The other part of it is pure emotion, as you say, that essentially the Americans are just British with a funny accent.
Yes.
Which it is true in many ways, but that isn't how the United States is governed. The United States is not governed in a way that is that has a patrician's benevolent view of Europe. It is governed in a far more cutthroat way, in a far more ruthless way, with zero regard. If you were to take a Spanish monarch ruling over parts of Italy, he would have a far more benevolent view towards the Italians than the ruling classes of the United States have towards Britain or the rest of Europe.
Yes.
They entertain this special relationship myth, but every president has to be told, look, you've just got to say that there's a special relationship.
Say the magic words.
Because you know,
yes.
And it's really important for them, and the prime minister wouldn't be happy if you didn't.
Yes. No, I think you're right that it has a lot to do with that sense of kinship, which is definitely real in historical and cultural terms. There's no question about that. But from our side, it's a little bit more. It has just a much higher emotional resonance. I mentioned Macmillan and Churchill earlier. Obviously, you have Churchill's famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, in which he's basically encouraging the Americans to pick up the baton of imperial leadership. And as I said earlier, there is this hope that the kind of somewhat exhausted British spirit would get a new lease on life by entering this vigorous American hegemon post-war. And that's basically what Churchill wanted. It probably didn't help that he had an American mother. And then as for Harold Macmillan, younger Harold Macmillan in 1944, who was obviously became prime minister later on, but in 1944 he was involved in the war effort, primarily in North Africa. And he noted to Richard Crossman famously in 1944, he was a classicist by training, Harold Macmillan, and he sort of brought that kind of British public school boy classicism to it. He said, we are Greeks to we are Greeks to the Americans. So we are Greeks to the Romans in this American empire.
Yes.
And it's vital that Britain acts as the base of operations for America's effort in Europe in the same way that the Greek slaves were made use of under the Emperor Claudius. And he literally hilariously uses that analogy, and you think, go on, push that logic a little bit further. Then, relations between the Greeks and the Romans weren't always so easy. That wasn't an easy transition. But he meant it quite sincerely from the context, it's clear.
Because there was a certain Christian benevolence that was assumed, which simply doesn't exist in the way the United States actually conducts its politics. And you've always had this left-wing influence in the United States that's sort of been worming its way through the institutions and getting to a point where instead of importing cultural pride from America or borrowed cultural pride from America, what was imported was DEI and hatred of the nation and all of feminism and all of that nonsense that ended up exploding in the United States, first in the university system and then throughout the rest of American culture.
Yeah.
So these aspects of American influence have been quite nefarious, and they've spread all over Europe. And they've contaminated all of European thinking.
Yes.
Combined with a very deep anti-Catholic sentiment,
Yep.
which really doesn't do you very much good if you're Spanish or Italian,
No.
for example, or French.
All of my Italian, Spanish, and right-wing friends. Oh, sorry, Italians. I only have right-wing friends. But all of my Spanish, Italian, and French right-wing friends think ill to varying degrees of American influence in the world. And I think it has a lot to do with what you're describing there.
The cultural exports of the United States have been disastrous for Europe.
Yes.
And the hostility to nationalism has been absolutely disastrous.
Yes.
And the way that the Europeans have tried to fit into their own nations and immigration story, simply to mimic that of America, has been purely destructive.
Yeah. Let's talk about this though. So I think I want to be fair to the Americans a little bit and say, I do think that there was a struggle in America over this before the victors in that struggle started exporting these things
here. The Americans lost their own internal war on nationalism.
In the early 20th century, I would say.
In the early 20th century, and then maximally in the civil rights movement.
That's definitely right. But so to give some of the, you do have, if you could read what congressmen were saying in defense of the 1924 Immigration Act, for instance, at the time, William Vail would be a good example. He was a Republican congressman, perfectly inoffensive English chap, who said, we like the nation how it is and we want to preserve it as an Anglo-Saxon Commonwealth. It's how he describes American identity.
Had that kind of sentiment won,
exactly,
you would have had a very different outcome.
Indeed. And it did win in the 1924 Act did get passed. But by the time you get to the 40s and 50s, I suppose the big book on this is Oscar Handlin's book, The Uprooted, which basically redefines America as by its very essence, a creedal nation full of immigrants. As I say, it's called The Uprooted. Terms like the American Creed, people think those go back to the founding. They come into widespread usage in the 1940s. And by the time you get to the 65 Immigration Act, the kind of propaganda has been set
Which
for
was
a revision of
supposed
America.
to not change the demographics of the United States.
Correct.
The promise of the Hart-Celler Act was that it would not affect the demographic composition of
Yep.
the United States. It would still be overwhelmingly white,
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
So this was sold under false pretenses.
Emmanuel Seller said 80% of immigration will be European.
Yes.
That's a direct quotation, and he was the chief sponsor in the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
And so I think it's key. That war was lost by Americans before we became collateral damage in a way.
Exactly.
You would agree with that account of the
Yes,
history?
but as that war was being fought, you still had the Suez intervention,
Yeah, it's true.
essentially on the Soviet side,
Yeah, this is true. Yes.
more or less on the Soviet side.
Yes.
And the consequences of that intervention was the empowering of Abdel Nasser and his various lunatic ideas. And that then led to the overthrow of various government systems from Libya in '59 to Iraq to Syria, that all ended up sort of trying to emulate Nasser based on the idea that this was the way forward. So it wasn't just contained to strengthening the Soviet Union in one particular moment. It also gave the Soviet Union a bunch of other Arab allies,
Right. Yes.
which are a direct result of that intervention.
So we have gone through the way in which the battle was first lost in America, and then we became collateral damage in that. And I can hear people hoping aloud right now that, well, maybe Americans are now going through a self-corrective process, and maybe we will be the beneficiaries of that. And so I'll give you just to set this up. The question is, like, does America now, if not in '56, want a strong Europe? So in that context, what do you make of the State Department's paper recently warning against civilizational erasure of Europe through replacement migration? And how do you square this with the fact that more or less everything Trump does, whether in Greenland or Iran, seems all but deliberately designed to empower the very bureaucrats committed to euthanizing the continent?
So that's the real issue. And I think part of the reality is the internal fighting within the administration between the people who believe the promises of Trump and the permanent state that seems to have taken control of the Trump administration. And you constantly see this issue with the United States. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago called President Irrelevant, with the argument being that you vote for Bush promising a more restrained foreign policy than Clinton, and you get Iraq and Afghanistan. You vote for Obama, no more stupid Middle Eastern wars, you get Libya and Syria.
Yeah.
You vote for Trump, first 4 years, it goes well. Biden comes in, he tries to pull out of Afghanistan. He's deliberately humiliated because the military planners knew that your last hold shouldn't be in Kabul International Airport, it should be in Bagram.
Yeah.
They knew that.
Bagram Air Base. Yes.
Bagram Air Base, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you get Trump 2, and what you get in response is a war with Iran.
Right.
And so there is this capacity on the part of the American state to just subdue elected officials.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read, when you see these contradictory signs between the national security strategy that came out in December 2025, which said Europe needs to halt its civilizational decline, we need a strong Europe, independent weapons manufacturing, independent capabilities,
Yes.
the capacity to stand up to Russia on its own, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, anti-immigration, what have you. Then you get a Middle Eastern war that is all but guaranteed to trigger waves of additional immigration.
Yeah, exactly. And so just for extra context here, you also had this at the same time have Trump, first president in a while, talking about America again as an Anglo-Saxon
Yes.
commonwealth. He sounds like some senator with a top hat from the 1920s when speaking in those terms. And so
He is an Anglophile.
So much he clearly is, and his mother's Scottish. But so much is encouraging on this front. But then you always need to watch what the hands are doing, not what the mouth is saying, I suppose.
Well, precisely.
Yes.
Because I think Trump concluded that if he doesn't just obey the permanent state, he will get killed.
Right. You think that's his calculation?
I think that's part of his calculation, and I think that he then decided, well, how can I just use this to make myself insanely rich and make my children insanely rich? Because you're seeing a level of corruption coming out of the Trump administration that is genuinely impressive.
Does he not have enough money already?
There's always room for more.
Right.
I mean, if you have a few $1 billion, you don't have as much influence as Zuckerberg or Musk.
Right.
So you're reaching a stage where there is this competition to see who can be the biggest Croesus.
Billionaires are as prone to status anxiety as anyone else.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so you see this effort at accumulating wealth through the various crypto stuff, through the investments in companies involved in natural resource supply chains, it's through investments in defense. And you're thinking, hold on a second. You're telling me that the president's portfolio is making 60 trades a day? But according to J.D. Vance, Trump personally is not involved in this. There's something off here.
Right.
There's something clearly off here.
Let's get to what Europe, and when I say Europe, I'm always including Britain, although we can talk about the extent to which their interests really are merged, do about this. So again, like as A.J.P. Taylor's remarks, which I quoted earlier, reflect, Europe was very much accustomed to balance of power politics throughout the 19th century. But the crucial point, I suppose, is that it was played within Europe rather than within the world as a whole, because Europe basically effectively was the center of the world. Now that the world is so much smaller, should Europe regard herself as, in some limited sense, a single power navigating a third way between America and China, or should foreign policy, including Britain's, remain overwhelmingly national? I should throw in here, of course, that Carl Schmitt, one of the things that he actually was working on, I believe after denazification, because he wasn't really allowed to, teach at universities anymore. But he did develop, in legal terms, a sort of Monroe Doctrine for Europe. This was on his mind in the later decades of his life. Where do you stand on these questions?
There are several things to think about here. When you think about interests, you're also thinking about values.
Yes.
Because that they do inform how you define your interests.
Yes.
If you look at the world today, the threats from any European capital are immigration, and especially Islamic immigration, India and its propensity to export, and like human quantitative easing.
Deliberately.
Yes, that is the Indian policy. Is how can we get as many Indians as possible into as many places as possible.
Living bridges, like Narendra Modi's on record.
Yeah. This is obvious.
Yeah.
China, which is trying to just become the central power again, or the center of the world.
The Middle Kingdom, yes.
The Middle Kingdom, exactly the term that I was looking for, yes. Middle meaning the center of the world, not moderate or anything of that sort.
No.
And you've got as a result of the backing for Israel, you've got the increased defense cooperation between Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey.
Yeah.
With Turkey clearly making a bid for domination of the entire Muslim world, including the southern Mediterranean, including Cyprus, including the Greek islands, and in the future, obviously, the Balkans.
Yes. And indeed boasting about its diaspora in Berlin too.
And boasting about its diaspora all over. And with if there was a call for jihad coming out of Istanbul, you know that pretty much every Muslim in Europe, or 80% of Muslims in Europe, would listen to it. So there are these realities here that have an intersection of values, because the values of Europe are fundamentally Christian, and that have a bunch of common threats. The balance of power policy was a direct result of all of the powers being immediate neighbors and similar.
In the 19th century, yes. Obviously before then, but
obviously before that.
But yeah.
The idea was that the only threat to Britain was Europe.
Yeah.
Today, this is no longer the case. But the problem is that the EU is genuinely an enemy of everything good and decent.
Yes.
So you could faff about all you want about the importance of Christian unity, and I am prone to do that as a Catholic, and I do believe that this should happen, and I do believe in an alliance based on Christendom, absolutely, but there is also reality, and if you're a Catholic, you have to deal with reality as well.
So given that, let's talk about a little bit about Britain specifically. do you think that Britain should effectively chart its own path, acting always as the late Alan Clark used to put it? He was once asked, like, what should Britain's sort of post-war geopolitical posture be? And he said we should be like a boxer, always on the balls of our feet. Or should Britain have a sort of set?
So there are certain things
geostrategic
dictated
path
by geography
Yes.
that aren't negotiable.
Of course, yes.
And that includes stopping Russia before it gets to Denmark, but not really far before then. So, Poland from a British perspective is negotiable so long as Germany is capable enough to check Russia. Or so long as there is a border, there's a Central European power, be it Austria, be it Germany, be it Poland, be it Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whatever it is,
Right.
that can put the brakes on Russian expansion.
Yes.
And that can keep Russia constrained. Because you don't want Russian fleets crossing the Danish Straits.
Nope.
That's one priority. There's a Greenland priority and an Iceland priority, which is securing the North Atlantic against both Russian and potential Chinese incursions. There's the need to maintain an alliance with the United States.
Yep.
As an Atlantic power, Britain is too small to go up against America.
Yep.
And culturally, there's no reason. There's enough common ground. And then there's the security of the Southern Atlantic. And thankfully, other than, there are no real Southern Atlantic powers, but you could see the importance of the Falklands and the importance of South Africa. So
Yes.
there are these fixtures of geography that are there that Britain has to keep in mind, and that does dictate a certain level of naval power
Yep.
intended to deny access to the Atlantic to hostile powers.
Yep.
In partnership with other European powers, in partnership with the United States, there are commonalities there.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the map and you see that Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, these are very natural allies. Portugal, very natural ally. The oldest ally
Since
of Britain.
1358, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yes.
Or
Maybe that might be slightly wrong.
I think you're wrong on the date. I don't think it's 58, but
Anyhow, it's definitely the 14th century.
yes, exactly. So these are sort of bits and pieces of alliances that are not changeable because they are dictated by geography.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are other issues, such as the attempt by the EU to legally control everyone
Yes.
and to regulate everybody to death.
Yep.
And there what you need is more patriotism in Europe that is opposed to this unpatriotic, overwhelming, overbearing regulatory system.
Smothering Great Big Mother, really.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, yes.
Exactly. It is the longhouse.
Yes.
It really is the longhouse. So that has to be dealt with and that has to be weakened. And that means you're looking at Le Pen as an ally, you're looking at Salvini as an ally, you're looking at
AfD, FPO in Austria. Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That's a wonderful sort of sketch of where you see Britain's geopolitical interests as residing this century, and of course it's always a function of geography to some extent. Like when I say Europe, I always mean the civilization of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
If I mean the EU, I will say the EU.
Mm-hmm.
So the question I suppose I would like to ask is, that despite the fact that we have left the European Union, like how much of Britain's geostrategic interests this century do you see as overlapping with the fundamental interests of Europe as a civilization?
Well, the fundamental interests of Europe as a civilization are to secure the Mediterranean
Yep.
and to have an accord with the Russians.
Yep.
Russia is always going to be a power.
Yep.
And the Muslim threat through the Mediterranean is always going to be there. And the migration threat through the Mediterranean is always going to be there. These are both things that are priorities for Britain.
Yes.
These are both things that are extremely important for Britain.
Yep.
And so there is this level of alignment there, but only with a sane and nationalist Europe.
Right.
And within that framework, if you look at things like trade and weapons manufacturing and things of that sort, you have to respect the French model of autonomy.
Yep.
But you also have to look realistically and say, there isn't going to be a new Anglo-Franco war. There's not going to be another war with France in our lifetimes. There's room for military cooperation there. There is room for trade cooperation there. There is some room within Europe for the original conception of the European Economic Community
Yes.
The problem is that how do you stop that thing from going insane?
Yeah, and becoming about, rather than sort of mutual recognition and getting along, it becomes a sort of like rationalist attempt at harmonization
Exactly.
across the board.
And the rationalist instinct comes directly from their faithlessness. It's a direct result of the fact that these are people who don't believe in God.
And Second World War trauma, which of course I imagine is linked.
Which is linked to it.
Yes.
I mean, one of the big consequences, the big falsehoods of the narratives of the World War I and World War II is that this was Christian Europe. No. This was Europe setting aside Christianity to the extent that in the second and third and fourth years of the First World War, officers had to make sure that regular soldiers didn't automatically break into automatic ceasefires over Christmas, as had happened in 1914. Christmas 1914, they all knew that you were not going to murder each other on Christmas. And spontaneous ceasefires broke out all over Europe. And had that Christian sentiment been in any way respected, the whole progress of the war would have been halted. And we would still have some of these European empires, rather than the imposed liberalism that came from the Americans with Anglo ideology.
Yes.
So there is
Anglo ideology shorn of its roots.
Because liberalism kind of works for the English, but that's it.
Yes, no.
A certain level of liberalism works for the English,
Yes.
but it is not a fine cultural export.
Yes, I think as I once put it to Carl Benjamin himself when he was on The Forge, sort of liberalism is a description of the peculiarity of the English soul. It's not too bad, but as a sort of universal schema,
Exactly.
it leaves much to be desired. You've mentioned Christianity.
Yes.
And so I have a question to you on this front. You are, of course, a Christian, and the West's Christian heritage may prove a pretty identifying marker in the clash of civilizations envisioned by Huntington, which is only likely to intensify in coming decades.
And is intensifying.
Yes. But naturally, to compete in this world, which is multipolar now, will require ditching what John Mearsheimer calls liberal dreams in favor of something like Palmerstonian realism, eternal interests, not eternal allies, and all the rest of it. But this can sound a little bit amoral, and therefore to some extent anti-Christian. The secular liberal, of course, believes in human rights, but the traditional Christian probably holds to something like natural rights.
Yes.
Can the moral dimension, here's the question, of Christianity be married to the obvious need to pursue a pretty unsentimental and unflinching foreign policy, realism, this century?
I don't think I was just reading Enoch Powell on precisely these kinds of questions.
Right.
And he makes an exceptional case that there is really no conflict between these things. And obviously you can't go around massacring entire cities Mongol style.
No.
But there is nothing unchristian about defending your core interests. There is nothing unchristian about saying, actually, no, asylum seekers aren't welcome, not least because they're not real asylum seekers. There is nothing Christian about imposed charity by the state. Charity is charity only if it's voluntary. Welfare and taxation to fund welfare is inherently amoral. You're just being compelled to do something. You can't be held morally accountable for something that you're forced to do.
Yes.
So the whole division there is a bit of a false one, and especially false when you think about Christian natural law and when you think about Christian philosophy, which does have a place for nations. The Pope does command you to be loyal to your nation above other nations, not above God. And so there's always been this correct order of God first, country second. And within that order, when you are defending the interests of your country, you're not doing anything immoral there. Of course, you could pursue it in an immoral way.
Yes.
You could, go around murdering women and children for no reason. That would obviously be immoral. But to say, I'm going to make sure that I can't be invaded and that my enemies are weak, there's nothing immoral about that. So what has happened is that basically Europe has been robbed of two things. It's still operating on Christian sentiment. it's still operating on Christian guilt, which is why the whole human rights discourse has any truck here, whereas it doesn't really have much traction in a place like India or in the Muslim world or what have you. It doesn't really carry. But it's also it's really been robbed of Christ, the celebration, the joy that balances the guilt, and Christ, the Logos, that allows you to think clearly because you are endowed with reason. And it is only through reason that you can read the scriptures and what they actually command you. And this is why Christianity developed natural law with a very systematized way of thinking about virtue and sin that distinguished between, killing an innocent and killing an enemy combatant. One is murder, one is obviously legitimate. And so it doesn't help to say, well, he's an enemy combatant, but he's living here on benefits. You're insane. You've submitted to the enemy.
Yes. Yes, I think many people, including some Christians, it has to be said, basically view Christ as a sort of first century AD John Lennon.
Yes.
And it's not quite how...
No.
It's not quite how
that's
how that worked.
It's not how he presents himself. It's not how he's presented in Revelations. It's definitely not how Christians throughout history understood Christ.
No.
Hilaire Belloc goes on about how Catholicism is at its best with its sword in its hand. Because there is this necessity to be able to fight, to be able to wage war.
Yes.
And as a Christian ruler, you are supposed to exercise certain virtues. And they include prudence and justice. And within prudence, you have to know what an enemy is. And within justice, you have to deliver to the enemy what he's about to deliver to you. You still act within moral restraints that are commanded by Christianity, including the regard for the individual and the regard for the innocent. Of course, that doesn't take away your duty to act as a king and to defend yourself.
I think the Hilaire Belloc you're talking, just for viewers who may be interested, I think is that in Europe and the Faith?
Yes.
That he speaks in those terms. And out of interest, this is a question that I'm asking, and I'm sure viewers will be interested too. What have you been reading of Enoch Powell's that tries to tackle some of of because I'm sure people would love to.
Wrestling with the Angel.
Wrestling with the Angel.
A very kind viewer mailed it to me.
Oh, great.
And I'm about to... It's an exceptional book. It's a really good book.
Very good.
Powell's thinking on Christianity is... I know that in some of his later stuff, he might have become a bit more heretical than I'd like. And you probably know my views on Anglicanism.
Yes.
But he is the peak of proper Anglican thinking, I would say.
Really?
And he's absolutely exceptional.
Yeah, well, it helps when you're proficient in 13 languages, including Hebrew.
It's just a tiny...
Yes.
The man is so erudite. It's genuinely... Yeah, the best prime minister that Britain never had.
I could not possibly agree more with that. Now, I will ask you one more question, Firas. This has been very interesting. Let's say it is the year 2100. Europe is as self-respecting and influential in relative terms, or maybe absolute terms, as it was in, let's just say 1913. What do the next 75 years need to look like for that to be a plausible scenario?
There's a couple of basics that never change, which are basically energy and food. There are these elementary things that never change. You can't have prosperity without energy abundance. And food abundance is one of the consequences of energy abundance. Be it in the age of plowing with bulls, or the modern age of chemical fertilizers derived from hydrocarbons. These things aren't changing in their very nature. So the first thing that needs to happen is just unleash drilling in the North Sea, unleash coal, build nuclear, stabilize your energy production, and keep on increasing it to aim to be the highest per capita energy consumer in the world. The more energy you're converting, the more it is that you're producing. And that should always be the objective. That should always be the objective. But you're not going to get good government without love. And the fundamental problem is that the European leadership and the British leadership and the American leadership have nothing but contempt for their people. You could see that Enoch Powell loved his constituents because he thought that it was his duty to represent their views accurately,
Yes.
including in the Rivers of Blood speech. That was him knowing his duty to love his constituents and to represent their views accurately. He didn't phrase it this way, but you could always see that this is what was it. This was what was underneath it. Whereas today's European leaders are all about how do we take away more power from our people and deliver it to the World Economic Forum. And you see that in the Epstein files, in the emails about Macron, where he's coordinating with the World Economic Forum and just implementing their agenda. And this is being communicated to Epstein. Like, you see it now. It's no longer a conspiracy theory. It has facts and evidence and documents backing it up. And why would you think that your people's expression on social media is a fundamental problem that you have to address? Because you hate them. You don't think that they should be allowed to speak. You're not interested in listening to them. The most generous thing that I could do to you if you and I disagree is to articulate your views in the best way that I can and then deal with them on their merits. That would be, if we were enemies, and thank God we're not, that would be me loving my enemy. To take his views seriously. That would be me seeing the beam in my eye before I see the mote in your eye. That would be a proper application of Christianity. Without Christianity, you end up essentially with a case system. And the one feature of the case system is the absolute disdain that people of the upper castes have towards people of the lower castes. That's the one feature of India. The Brahmins have utter contempt for everybody underneath them. And down the chain it goes.
Yes.
That's what you get without Christian love. And in Europe, we've weirdly ended up with a case system.
Yes. So I suppose if we had to sum it up, what you're saying, Britain needs is sort of nationalism with respect to demographics, pragmatism with respect to energy resources, realism abroad, all tempered by a renewal of Christian charity.
I would argue that Christianity is the starting condition to genuine restoration. Because what are you restoring Britain for? You're restoring it because you love your people. Where does that love come from? It is ordained by God, and it is what defines your people is Christianity. Nobody in Britain, for all of the pretensions of the pagans, nobody's actually operating on Viking morality here. Nobody's thinking in terms of Viking morality. And let's just get past that nonsense. People are thinking in terms of Christian morality because this is what they've been reared to do for generations now. And it's built in. And if you doubt that it's built in, go to a place like Egypt and Lebanon. See the difference between the Christian communities and the Muslim communities. They are very stark and very real. Not to say that there aren't bad Christians
of course.
or good Muslims. This isn't the point. The point is they are genuinely different because they've been shaped differently. And so the precondition is actually a spiritual one. And this is what nobody wants to talk about. That you need a spiritual renewal to justify your material renewal. Because you're not doing it for mammon. You're doing it because you see yourself in a web of loving relationships with your community. And what animates the morality in which this love is expressed is Christianity. And so I would say that faith is a precondition for actual renewal. And look at Turkey. Look at what Erdogan has managed to do with Turkey. Turkey for 70 years was ruled by a bunch of secular atheists, essentially.
Yes.
Erdogan takes over as someone who loves Islam, Yes, the Turkish currency is collapsing again, but it's always collapsing. And it's been collapsing since the Ottoman times. This is not new. What is new is the level of industrial output in Turkey, and the fact that Turkish weapons are competitive on a world market, and the fact that Turkey is becoming the business leader of the Muslim world, etc., etc. So you have to govern people in accordance with their...
Spiritual inheritance.
Thank you. Yes.
Firas Modad, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.